The winter of 1887 was the harshest Montana had seen in decades. I was riding through the Bitterroot Valley, my horse's breath forming white clouds in the bitter air, when I heard a sound that cut through the howling wind like a knife through silence. It was a scream, desperate and raw, coming from the direction of the frozen Bitterroot River. My name is Samuel Creek, and I've been a ranch hand for the better part of 20 years. I've seen my share of hardship, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to witness. The temperature had dropped to nearly 30 below, and the river had been frozen solid for weeks, or so we all thought. I spurred my horse toward the sound, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The snow was knee-deep, making progress slow and treacherous. As I crested the small hill overlooking the river, I saw her, a young woman, maybe 25 years old, thrashing in a hole in the ice about 30 feet from the bank. Her long brown hair was already stiff with ice, and her lips were blue. As midnight, she must have been trying to cross when the ice gave way beneath her. The current had swept her downstream, but somehow she'd managed to grab onto the edge of the break. Her fingers were white, gripping the ice with what little strength she had left. "Hold on," I shouted, though I wasn't sure she could hear me over the wind and her own chattering teeth. I tied my horse to a sturdy pine and grabbed the rope from my saddle. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the riverbank, each step careful and deliberate. One wrong move and I'd be in that freezing water with her. The ice near the bank was thick enough to hold my weight, but I could see spider web cracks spreading out from where she'd fallen through. I had to work fast, laying flat on my belly to distribute my weight. I crawled toward the hole, the rope coiled in my hands. "I'm coming for you," I called out. Her eyes found mine, green eyes, bright as spring grass, filled with terror but also hope. She was fighting, still fighting. Even as hypothermia was setting in, I could see her strength failing, her grip on. The ice was slipping, and her body was going into shock from the cold. The water temperature couldn't have been more than a few degrees above freezing, if that. I'd seen men die in water like this in less than 15 minutes. "What's your name?" I shouted, trying to keep her conscious and alert. "Emily," she managed to gasp out, her voice barely audible. "Emily Harrison. Emily, I'm Samuel. I'm going to throw you this rope, and I need you to grab it with both hands. Can you do that for me?" She nodded weakly, her whole body shaking violently from the cold. I made a loop in the rope and threw it toward her. The first throw fell short. By several feet, the wind was working against me, and my hands were already numb despite my thick gloves. "Come on, Sam," I muttered to myself, pulling the rope back. Emily's head was starting to dip below the surface more frequently. Time was running out. The second throw was perfect. The loop landed right next to her, and with what seemed like her last bit of strength, she grabbed onto it with both hands. But as I started to pull, I realized the full extent of the problem. The ice around the hole was too thin to support both our weights. If I pulled her straight up, it would break, and we'd both end up in the river. I had to think fast, crawling backward. I spread my weight over as much ice as possible while pulling her toward the thicker ice near the bank. Every few seconds, I could hear the ice cracking beneath us, sounds like gunshots in the cold air. "Stay with me, Emily," I called out. "Don't you dare give up on me now." Her face was pale as snow, her lips purple, but she held on, inch by inch. I pulled her through the water toward the bank. When I finally got her to the edge where the ice was thick enough, I reached down and grabbed her under the arms, hauling her up onto the frozen surface. She was unconscious by then, her body limp and cold as stone. Her wet clothes were already starting to freeze in the bitter air. I knew I had minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia would claim her life. Carrying Emily's unconscious form, I stumbled through the deep snow toward my horse. Her body felt like ice in my arms, and I could barely feel a pulse when I pressed my ear to her chest, but she was breathing shallow, irregular breaths that came out in tiny puffs of white dot. My cabin was 3 miles away, but there was an old trapper's shelter about a mile downstream that I remembered from my younger days. It wasn't much, just for walls and a roof, but it would have to do. Emily needed warmth, and she needed it now. I managed to get her onto my horse, holding her against my chest as we rode through the snowdrifts. Her wet clothes were freezing solid, crackling like paper every time we hit a bump. I could feel her body temperature dropping even further, and her breathing was becoming more labored. The trapper's shelter was exactly as I remembered it, a small log structure with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of rough furniture. The door was stuck with ice, but I managed to force it open with my shoulder. Inside, it was barely warmer than outside, but at least we were out of the wind. I laid Emily on the single cot and immediately started working on getting a fire going. My hands were shaking so badly from the cold and adrenaline that I could barely strike a match. But eventually, I got a small flame going in the fireplace. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon I had a decent fire burning. But Emily's clothes were soaked through and frozen. I knew I had to get them off her if she was going to have any chance of survival. It was improper, certainly, but it was a matter of life and death. I found an old blanket in a wooden chest and turned my back as I carefully removed her frozen dress and undergarments, wrapping her immediately in the blanket. Her skin was white as paper, with a blue tinge that told me hypothermia had already set in deep. Her pulse was so weak I could barely find it, and her breathing had become dangerously shallow. I'd seen men die from hypothermia before, and Emily was showing all the signs. I dragged the cot as close to the fire as I dared, and began the long process of trying to warm her back to life. I rubbed her hands and feet, trying to get circulation flowing again. I heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, placing them around her body. Every few minutes, I checked her pulse and breathing, terrified that I might lose her. For hours, I worked over her unconscious form. The fire burned bright and hot, and slowly, the cabin began to warm, but Emily remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. As the night wore on, I began to fear the worst. It was around midnight when I noticed the first sign of improvement. Her breathing seemed to deepen slightly, and when I checked her pulse, it felt a little stronger. Her skin was starting to lose that deathly blue tinge, though she was still pale as snow. I must have dozed off near dawn, exhausted from the night's efforts. When I woke, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin had grown cold again. I quickly built up the fire and checked on Emily. Her breathing was definitely stronger, and there was actually a hint of color in her cheeks, but she was still unconscious, and I was starting to worry about how long she'd been out. I'd heard stories of people who survived hypothermia but never woke up, their brains damaged by the lack of oxygen and cold. I found myself talking to her, telling her stories about my life on the ranch, anything to fill the silence and maybe reach her wherever she was. "You're going to be all right, Emily," I kept saying. "You're a fighter. I could see it in your eyes. Back there at the river, you just need to come back to us now." It was late in the afternoon on the second day when Emily finally stirred. I was adding more wood to the fire when I heard a soft moan behind me. I turned to see her eyes fluttering open, those green eyes that had looked at me with such desperate hope from the frozen river. "Where?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Where am I?" I knelt beside the cot, relief flooding through me like warm sunshine. "You're safe," I said gently. "You're in an old trapper's cabin. You fell through the ice on the Bitterroot River. Do you remember?" She closed her eyes for a moment, and I could see her trying to piece together the memories. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "You," she said, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch my face. "You pulled me out. I remember your voice calling to me." Her voice broke with emotion. "Thank you." Those two words hit me harder than any punch I'd ever taken. The way she said them, with such genuine gratitude and emotion, made everything I'd gone through worthwhile. "What's your name?" she asked weakly. "Samuel Creek, ma'am. But you can call me Sam." "Sam," she repeated, as if testing the name. "I'm Emily Harrison. I was trying to get to Missoula. My brother lives there. He doesn't know I'm coming." I helped her sit up slowly, supporting her back against the wall. She was still weak, but the color was returning to her face, and her eyes were clear and alert. "What happened, Emily? How did you end up trying to cross that river in the middle of winter?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with pain. "I was running away," she said simply, "from my husband. Former husband, I suppose. He wasn't a good man, Sam. He hurt me, and when I tried to leave, he said he'd kill me before he'd let me go. I felt anger rise in my chest at her words, but I kept my voice gentle. Where were you coming from, Butte? I took what little money I could and left in the middle of the night. I thought if I could get to my brother in Missoula, I'd be safe. But the stagecoach only runs once a week in winter, and I was afraid to wait. I thought I could make it on foot, through the mountains, in winter. I couldn't hide my shock at the danger she'd put herself in. I didn't know what else to do, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was so scared, Sam. I thought the river was completely frozen. I'd heard people say it was solid as rock. It was mostly, I said. But there's a spring upstream that keeps a current flowing underneath, creates weak spots. You couldn't have known. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between us. Emily was getting stronger by the hour, and I could see the fighter in her that had kept her alive in that freezing water. Sam, she said finally, what you did, risking your own life to save mine. Why? I thought about her question for a long moment. I suppose because it was the right thing to do, I said. Where I come from, you don't leave someone to die if you can help it, especially not a woman in trouble. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers still cold but warming. Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people would have ridden on, told themselves it wasn't their problem. Then they wouldn't be much of people, would they? That evening, as Emily grew stronger and more alert, she told me more about her life. She'd been married to Thomas Harrison, a wealthy mine owner in Butte, for 3 years. From the outside, it looked like a perfect marriage. She had beautiful clothes, a grand house, everything money could buy. But behind closed doors, Thomas was violent and controlling. He started with words, she explained, staring into the fire, telling me I was stupid, worthless, that no one else would ever want me. Then it became pushing, slapping, when I tried to leave the first time. He broke my arm and told everyone I'd fallen down the stairs. How did you finally escape? He went to Denver on business. I knew it was my only chance. I took what money I could find and left in the middle of the night. I was so terrified he'd come after me that I barely slept for 3 days. He won't find you, I said firmly. Not here, and not with me looking out for you. She looked at me with those green eyes, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Trust. This woman had been hurt by a man who was supposed to protect her, yet she was placing her faith in a stranger who'd pulled her from a frozen river. We stayed in the trapper's cabin for 3 more days while Emily regained her strength. During that time, I learned more about this remarkable woman than I'd learned about anyone in years. She was educated, unusual for women in those days, and had taught school before her marriage. She loved books and had a quick wit that made me laugh despite our circumstances. More importantly, I saw her strength. The same determination that had kept her alive in that freezing water was helping her recover now. She refused to be defeated by what had happened to her. On the 4th morning, she announced she was ready to travel. I need to get to my brother, she said. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. You haven't imposed on anything, I replied. But if you're set on going to Missoula, I'm going with you. Sam, you've done more than enough. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling you. I met her eyes. You think I'm going to let you travel alone through these mountains? After what just happened, think again. The journey to Missoula took 2 days on horseback. Emily rode behind me, her arms around my waist, and I was acutely aware of her presence every mile we traveled. Something had changed between us during those days in the cabin. What had started as a rescue had become something deeper. We talked as we rode, sharing stories of our lives, our dreams, our fears. I told her about my years working ranches across Montana, about the loneliness of a life spent moving from place to place. She talked about her love of teaching, her hope to someday have children of her own, her dream of a life free from fear. What will you do after we reach your brother? I asked as we made camp on our final night on the trail. I don't know, she admitted. Start over, I suppose. Maybe find work teaching again. Try to build a life where I can be happy. And if Thomas comes looking for you, her face darkened. Then I'll face him. I won't run anymore. Sam, I won't live in fear. That night, as we sat by our campfire under a canopy of stars, Emily surprised me by taking my hand. I need to tell you something, she said. These past few days, getting to know you, it's shown me what it means to be treated with kindness and respect. I'd forgotten that was possible. I squeezed her hand gently. Emily, let me finish, she said. I know we've only known each other a few days, but you saved my life in more ways than one, not just from the river, but from believing I wasn't worth saving. We reached Missoula the next afternoon, and I'll admit my heart was heavy as we approached the town. I'd grown to care for Emily more than I'd thought possible, and the idea of leaving her with her brother and riding away felt like tearing a piece of my heart out. Her brother, David, was a blacksmith with a kind face and gentle manner. When Emily told him what had happened, I saw rage flash in his eyes at the mention of Thomas Harrison. But he welcomed his sister with open arms. You'll always have a home here, he told her. And Sam, he turned to me, I can never repay what you've done for my sister. No repayment necessary, I said, though I was looking at Emily as I spoke. As I prepared to leave the next morning, Emily walked me to where my horse was tied. Where will you go? She asked. I don't know. Find work somewhere. Maybe head south. For the winter. She was quiet for a moment, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small photograph. This is me, she said. Before I married Thomas, before I forgot who I was. I want you to have it, so you'll remember the woman you saved. I took the photograph. Looking at the young woman in the picture, she was smiling, her eyes bright with hope and joy. I'll treasure it, I said. Sam, she said softly, if you ever find yourself back this way, I'll find you, I promised. I rode out of Missoula that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. For the next several months, I drifted from ranch to ranch, working where I could find employment. But Emily was never far from my thoughts. It was spring when I finally admitted to myself what I'd known all along. I was in love with Emily Harrison, not just grateful for having saved her life, but truly, deeply in love with the woman I'd gotten to know during those days in the cabin and on the trail to Missoula. I turned my horse around and headed back north. When I arrived in Missoula, David greeted me with a knowing smile. I wondered when you'd come back, he said. Emily was in the schoolhouse, teaching a class of children. I watched through the window as she worked with them, her face animated and happy. This was the woman from the photograph, the one who had existed before fear and abuse had dimmed her spirit. When school let out, she walked outside and saw me standing there. The smile that spread across her face was worth every mile I'd traveled. You came back, she said simply. I promised I would. Sam, there's something I need to tell you. Thomas, he found me. He came here last month, demanding I come back with him. My blood ran cold. What happened? I told him no. I told him I wasn't afraid anymore, that I'd found my strength. David stood with me, and so did half the town. Thomas left, but he swore he'd be back. Then I got here just in time. That evening, as we walked along the river, a different river, one that flowed free and warm in the spring air, Emily took my hand. I've been thinking about what you said that night by the campfire, she said, about building a life where you can be happy. I think I'd like to build that life with you, Sam, if you'll have me. I stopped walking and turned to face her. Emily Harrison, are you asking me to marry you? She laughed, the sound like music in the evening air. I suppose I am. Is that terribly improper? Instead of answering, I kissed her. It was our first kiss, but it felt like coming home. We were married that summer in a small ceremony at David's house. Emily wore a simple white dress she'd made herself, and I wore my best shirt and the suit I'd bought for the occasion. It wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was perfect. As we exchanged vows, I thought about that frozen river where I'd first seen Emily, fighting for her life in the icy water. Neither of us could have known then that saving her life would end up saving mine. Emily and I built a good life together in Missoula. I found work at a ranch outside of town, and Emily continued teaching. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and every day I woke up grateful for the chance encounter that brought us together. Thomas Harrison never came back to Missoula. We heard later that he died in a mining accident in Colorado, and while we didn't celebrate his death, we were relieved to finally be free of his shadow. Years later, when our children would ask how their parents met, Emily would tell them the story of the frozen river. She'd tell them about the importance of helping others, about courage in the face of danger, and about how love can grow from the most unexpected circumstances. But she always ended the story the same way. Your father saw me in that river and didn't hesitate to risk his own life to save mine. And when I opened my eyes in that cabin and saw his face, I knew I was safe, not just from the cold, but safe in a way I'd never been before. Looking back now, 40 years later, I realize that Emily was wrong about one thing. She thanks me for saving her life, but the truth is, she saved mine. Before I pulled her from that frozen river, I was just drifting through life, working from ranch to ranch with no real purpose or direction. Emily gave me something to live for, someone to protect and cherish. She showed me what it meant to be truly needed, truly loved. In saving her life, I found my own, and that's a story worth telling. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories, and hit that like button if you believe in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them.